Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to pass over to Katrina now to welcome our panellists.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Yep, afternoon. Welcome to this Fair Museum Jobs Summit session all about volunteering. Volunteering and unpaid internships have long been a core entry route into this sector, but often only open to a privileged few. This is not news to anybody, or shouldn't be, and there's a lot of research and information out there about the issues inherent in relying on unpaid labour as a core entry route. Our panel today will consider ways to volunteer in museums for career development and look at ways to avoid also being exploited in the process. So I'm Katrina Wilson. I'm head of the Petrie Collection at UCL, and I'm also a committee member of Fair Museum Jobs. So what I'm going to do next is move around our panel in turn and ask them to introduce themselves. And I'll start with Garry, please, if that's all right.
Hello, everyone. My name's Garry Haines. I'm archivist currently for the RAF Museum. I've started my career as a volunteer. I was a volunteer for about 6 or 7 years. I've been an archivist for about 20 years now. I've also recruited and managed volunteers as well.
Hello, thank you, Garry. Stuart, please.
Hello, so I'm Stuart. I'm currently a first-year PhD student at the University of Leeds. But previously I've done a fair bit of volunteering, including at the Royal Armouries in Leeds and the York Castle Museums, as well as various other heritage institutions.
Thanks. Eleanor, please.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I work for the Victoria and Albert Museum, but I've done a lot of volunteering in other museums and heritage, such as the Imperial War Museum, Perth Museum and Art Gallery, and Emery Walker House. Yeah, like you said, I've done a lot of volunteering, but I've never managed volunteers.
Thank you. Anna, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna. I've worked in different roles in museums and heritage for the past 6 years. I've volunteered before libraries as well, and I've been on both sides. So I am currently a volunteer, but I've also been a volunteer manager for a couple of years for the National Trust, which was a great experience. I'm now completing my Master's in Heritage Management, and I'm volunteering in 3 different organisations locally. So I volunteer at the Box, which is the Plymouth Museum, as a gallery assistant. I also volunteer with events for the Mayflower Makers, which was supposed to be this year for the commemoration of the 400 years of the Mayflower voyage. And I also volunteer as a collections volunteer at the Royal Cornwall Museum, but that's being sort of up in the air at the moment because of COVID, which I think is something we'll probably talk a bit more about later.
Oh, I just muted myself by mistake. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Pauline, please.
Hi everyone. I am currently doing a master's in art gallery and museum studies at the University of Manchester. And prior to this, I was a volunteer across quite a few museums in Cambridgeshire, notably the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, Kettle's Yard in Cambridge as well, and the lovely Ely Stained Glass Museum.
So that's my old stomping ground. I love all of those places. I also volunteer, just so everybody knows for my context, I have also volunteered in different museums in order to get into the sector. So it was an entry route for me too. So I wondered if we could start with talking about what it's like to volunteer in a museum or heritage organisation while CV building. So the highs and lows of that. So because people volunteer for different reasons, but today we're talking about as a CV building exercise. So would anyone like to start?
Yeah,
Garry,
I don't mind starting on that. When I started volunteering, it was over 20 years ago now, and basically I've had no confidence. I'd been out of work for about 10 years. The job centre phoned me up and said you have to do a job placement, otherwise you lose what's called then your dole money. Not sure what it's called now. And basically I ended up phoning up lots of libraries, and one librarian said we don't want anybody but the archivist might. So I put the phone down and looked in the dictionary to see what an archivist was, because I didn't have a clue. Went there and started, and on the very first day I was shown so much trust and gained loads of confidence right at the very beginning that was the best thing for volunteering for me. Literally on day one I got that. The downside was really having to convince my job centre that I was available for work while I was trying to do that. There was no such apprenticeship schemes or anything. When I left school, I was offered 3 jobs, police, army or builder, and none of them particularly appealed to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Eleanor?
Yeah. Sorry. No, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag when you're trying to volunteer, and often you do have to try and hold down another job because it's just really not feasible to do volunteering and have no form of job whatsoever. I've volunteered for quite a few places. I still volunteer now in the name of development, but it's really hard, especially if you work for another heritage sector that perhaps is not fond of you going out and using your spare time to volunteer for another organisation. Personally, I've had some experience of organisations feeling that they have control over what you do on your days off, you know, which is an interesting perspective. But also, I've also worked for places that are more than happy to try and, you know, plan so that your days off are on the same every week so that you can volunteer at the same time every week for a different organization. But it is difficult to do, and if you don't have the stamina sometimes for it, it can make it harder to want to persevere, and you can just be like, oh well, what's the point of volunteering if I'm not going to get anywhere with it. It can take a really long time to even have enough sort of volunteering to be seen as having experience in the sector, so it can be really difficult.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything about volunteering for CV building? Stuart.
So
and then
I
Pauline.
initially started volunteering in museums because I realised in the second year of my undergraduate history degree that I should probably look at actually doing a job and not just sit in the academic institution. So I'd started trying to build up a bit of a portfolio of experience, and with an eye of getting a job after after I finished my degree. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, so I just continued volunteering, and like others, I had to get a full-time job in order to support myself, but I did that at retail instead. Yeah, it was quite a challenge trying to juggle a full-time retail job and then doing volunteering on your days off. But it's certainly, it's nice. I always thought that the volunteering was quite nice, a change of pace compared to my other job that I was doing, but it is quite demanding, especially if you're doing 6 days, if you're including both your work and your volunteering. So it's definitely not for everyone, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Pauline, did you want to add something there?
I started volunteering because I was working in the tourism industry before, and I was on a short contract. So when my contract ended, I was unemployed, and whilst looking for a job, I was volunteering, and that really helped me not lose it, basically, in unemployment. And not only that, but the experience itself really determined me that I wanted to go into that sector, but also helped me in terms of making contacts. And my supervisors were really helpful, helping me prepare for interviews, writing references, stuff like that. So I think that's extremely valuable, as much as the experience you'll be getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. We'll come on to that kind of return aspect in a bit. Anna, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think everybody's raised some really good points, but I think it's the self-care sometimes that's really hard to sort of like balance, because I mean, I'm a mature student, and I was, you know, sort of doing a full-time degree and volunteering 1 to 2 days a week, and then to have time for yourself actually. And I think that's what sometimes people don't realize, that it's not just about work. And I think sometimes, depending on where you are, volunteering can feel like a job. Unfortunately, I don't think it should be the case. So yeah, I think I just wanted to add that it is. I think Ellen has sort of touched upon it, and it's just really important for you as a volunteer to make sure that you are keeping time for yourself and that you're drawing the line, so you actually have that time to wind down and relax and look after yourself as well.
think that's a really important point. And I think this year, some of those self-care aspects have really come to the fore for a lot of people. And I hope it's or for lots of organizations, and I hope it's something that lasts or outlasts this time if it ever ends. I get the sense that organizations have taken a bit more note of that. So, but that's really important with volunteering. So kind of following on from some of the things you were saying, I was wondering how volunteers can tailor their placements to their advantage. So you've got this set up, you've found a way to do some time in the week, some volunteering alongside a job. How can you tailor your placements so that you get enough out of it for yourself as a volunteer? What kind of things would you recommend, Anna?
I think maybe because I've been a volunteer manager before, I think it's about not being afraid to talk to whoever sort of line managing you, or if there is a volunteer supervisor or coordinator or manager, actually not being afraid of sitting down over a cup of tea and just saying, well, this is my sort of like, this is the bigger picture, this is my goal, my career goal, or my personal development goal, and you know, how can I get more involved with things here, use my time effectively, and to support you as well, and to actually build into my career goals. And it was always lovely having those conversations with volunteers before, because you know, it really shows that obviously they are committed and they are passionate about what they do, and they, you know, they take what they do seriously as well, which is brilliant for the organization. And I think as a volunteer, what I try to do within my sort of limits is sort of try to say yes to opportunities that may come along through the volunteering role you are doing. So things like talks or workshops or events, and even, you know, depending on where you are, sometimes there is training that they can pay for you to do. There is a budget for that, so not being afraid to tap into these resources, you know, even like things like first aid training, or you know, conservation training and things like that.
Thank you. And also, Garry, so I'll come on to you in 2 seconds, but for example, where I've been before, there's lots of regional training programs through museum development offices, for example, where the training's free and organizations can have free places. And that's something that any good volunteer manager worth their salt will be keeping an eye out for their volunteers. But you can definitely keep an eye out as a volunteer too, and ask to go on them, definitely. Garry, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I was just going to echo what Anna said, really, that it's really important to talk to your line manager. If you're a volunteer, the line manager should have conversations with you. I've done exactly the same thing, had a cup of tea with the possible volunteer, treated it like a sort of mini job interview, asked them what they wanted to get out of it, and taking it like that. And they should also be put on specific projects as well, rather than just coming in for the sake of coming in to have a volunteer in the building. It should be specific projects that they're doing, and they should also be like managing them, having meetings with them every couple of weeks or something, you know, proper one-to-ones, as if they're a fully paid up member of the service.
Thank you very much. Yes, definitely. Stuart.
So I agree with very much what both Anna and Garry have said. If you want to do something, just ask someone, like ask your line manager, because the worst that can happen is they can say no, because for whatever reason. But the other thing I'd say is try and do as much varied opportunities as you can. So what I found was, because I was jumping back and forth between university and various bits and pieces, I volunteered in quite a few different places, doing quite a few different roles. So I did various bits in like handling objects with the public, and then I was in a library for a while, stacking shelves and doing things like that, and then managed to conserve some books and things like that. And then when I did my MA as well in museum studies, there was the opportunity for a placement there. So that was working with the archival collections there and getting in experience with those. So I'd say try and do as much as you can, as in and as many different things as you can as well.
Yeah, I think that variety is really key if you're in a museum where you can try lots of different things. And actually, I wondered if I've often wondered if that's a reflection of volunteering in a small versus a really big organization. So if you're in a small organization, maybe I've thought you could try a few more different things. In a big organization, you might be more likely to get the kudos of a big name. And so maybe those two strands would be worth pursuing. And did Pauline or Eleanor, did you want to add anything about tailoring placements to your advantage at all? Pauline?
I just completely agree with what Stuart just said, and I did exactly the same thing. And also just try to don't have like, basically be very open-minded. You know, you might see many opportunities, well, at least, you know, before COVID, and you might think, well, I'm not sure about that, I'm not sure about this, but it's worth giving everything a try, and then trying and see if you enjoy it. Just give it a try, be curious.
Be curious, I like that. That's good, I like that a lot. So it's kind of the flip side of that. I was wondering, thinking a little bit about exploitation. So there's that angle of having volunteers, like Garry said, just for the sake of having volunteers, or I'm wondering if everybody has had the similar experience of me where you've been given the task of photocopying. I've done photocopying, and after that vowed that I would never do that to somebody else, not without really good reason and not without a lot of other stuff. I wondered if you'd like to talk a bit about what exploitation can look like. So aside from the obvious and very illegal approach of bringing in a volunteer to replace a paid role, which you should never, no organisation should do, it's illegal. But aside from that, what does exploitation look like, and what should volunteers be wary of? So what kind of things should you watch out for as bad practice? Eleanor.
Yeah, I would say I have some experience of last year. I won't name them, but they were at a heritage site, and they advertised a volunteership, which was essentially just a little bit of preventative conservation and sort of being a presence in the place. So it was very much advertised as this. So when I went through, I got the volunteership, and it then transpired to be basically doing assistant conservation job, but without pay, which at the time I was torn, because I was thrilled to have the experience, but also was balancing it between my actual job and the fact that, you know, they aren't paying me and they were wanting me to come in every day and do this amount of work. And I sat with it for a week or two, and I did sort of do it, and then I sort of said to them, like, well, you know, when you did tell me about this role, it wasn't quite this extreme. It does feel like I'm doing an actual job. And their attitude seemed to be more of, well, if you don't want it, we can give it to someone else. But they didn't seem to be at all upset by the fact that they were suggesting you should do this whole job for free. And it was very much that sort of like, we're giving you the experience, so you don't need to be paid, which I think is very much something you should watch out for, because if you think you can manage it, then that's absolutely fine. But it is that thing of, well, you are exploiting me to do basically two jobs when I'm being paid for one. So yeah, I think be very wary of how things are sold to you, and then when you get into the role, be careful of how much extra things they're giving you, because there is the opportunity that could be someone's paid role, and instead they're giving it to you for free.
Thank you. Very important. Garry.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that really, and just say that I always, when I've got somebody in, it's always had a beginning, middle and end of a project. And also the thing, it's not happened to me, but things I know that have happened in the past is, I think as an archivist, one of my biggest risks is in the past, I've probably been replaced by a volunteer. I know that's happened. And also to make sure that you find out things like, if you're going to start like travel expenses, and even things like lunch expenses, you know, can you bring in a packed lunch, or are you expected to go to the expensive cafe? That sort of thing, you know, all that stuff you should really speak about to your line manager right at the beginning. And if you don't like what they're telling you to do, just literally say, I'm not doing it. I know it's easy to say, but yeah, we've all gone down the photocopying route at some point or the other, I think.
Yeah, and while you were talking about the travel expenses, I'm going to ask Lucy to see if she can find this, and I'm really sorry, Lucy, if it's really hard, but I do remember there's legal regulations around what you can offer for travel and food and recompense without it crossing the line of effectively being some sort of pay. And if an organisation crosses that line, you can ask them to pay you a salary as a result. So it's often worth being armed with that information in case you decide you'd quite like to get some money back from an organisation for the work you've done. So, well done. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, anybody else about exploitation? Anna.
I was just going to add that I think in relation to, I think what Eleanor said, at least with the National Trust, we were moving on to a system where we had like role descriptions. And I think since working there, I have seen that in many other museums and heritage places. And I think having that role description is sort of like a shield for you as a volunteer as well, because you have your tasks, your main tasks laid out there. So if anything, if a job advertisement looks, a volunteer advertisement looks like something, and then you look at the role description, it's something completely different, or they're expecting you to go every week for a day, or every week for half a day and do loads of stuff that is literally the same as a paid role. Use that to your advantage as well, and just it's like a red flag, isn't it? Just make sure that they do have that specified.
Yeah, definitely. And that reminds me of thinking about things to do with restrictive hours. So I've seen volunteer placements described as you have to come in every Tuesday for 2 years from 9 till 5. And I've had a volunteer I used to have in one organization had a placement at a national, and the hours were something, say 9 till 3. And she said, "Can I do 8:30 to 2:30 because that works better with my trains?" And was told, "No, because that's the hours. You have no choice." And then was said, "If you don't like it, we'll get somebody else." And she couldn't do it because it just didn't make sense for her, and so she had to walk away. But that seems wildly unreasonable to me, and I would not want to volunteer for them at all. So, yep. Garry,
Yeah, I was
you about to
just
say?
gonna,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry, I was just going to add to what Anna said about, what they should have is if you're going as a volunteer role in a museum or gallery, you should have a specific job description. And then you can, at least if they try to put anything else on you, say, well, hang on a minute, even though I'm hooked and you're relying on my passion for this role, this is what I set out to do. If you want me to do anything else, yeah, I'll do it, but it would be nice to get paid for it.
Thank you. I think you have to be, I think organizations have to be careful not to call it a job description. They might have to call it something else, but I can't remember the exact wording. But effectively, yes, that encapsulated role summary. Stuart.
So adding to the part about like role descriptions, maybe identify ones that look more like projects. So you're doing a specific project rather than just a generic role. So you know very much that this is what you're doing. This project is what you'll be spending your time doing there. And if you go beyond that, perhaps maybe challenge it. But I was also going to make the general point that yes, museums are saying, look, if you don't like it, we can get someone else. But if you could probably use that to your advantage. So you can say, look, there's lots of opportunities for volunteering out there. I'm going to leave unless you agree to what I'm saying. So I think there is a way of framing it, and I know that the power dynamics are difficult in such situations, but certainly try and get people on side.
Yeah, power dynamics is a really key problem, especially when you're volunteering for CV building, and you don't want to piss off future employers. Nobody does. That's why it's so difficult. So can I recommend Fair Museum jobs for that kind of thing? So please feel free to send us messages. We love to call people out on bad practice. That's why we're here. Would anyone else like to add anything? And if not, I will move on. Anna, are you trying to? No? Okay, cool. So I was wondering then if what ways volunteer managers could make placements that do not exploit. So what kind of things could volunteer managers offer as a return for the input of volunteers who are there for CV building? What kind of things might they share? Would anyone like to leap in? Stuart.
So from a practical perspective, like covering transport costs or lunch costs, because in most of my placements, I've been fortunate enough to been able in like cycling distance, so I haven't had to cover any costs. But when I was commuting to Leeds to go to the Royal Armouries from York, it added up quite quickly, and there wasn't any reimbursement, unfortunately. So that's definitely something to watch out for, and it can be a bit difficult if your finances are in a precarious position already.
Eleanor, go for it.
Yeah, I'd just say that it's flexibility, I think, is key. So like whoever's hiring volunteers should be fully aware that most of the volunteers will probably be having a job elsewhere, whether that's in the museum or not. And there should be some sort of understanding that some employers won't be flexible for someone to volunteer. So therefore the volunteering should be flexible around that person. Like I mentioned earlier, like where I've worked before, there has been an issue where the workplace wouldn't move the days off, or if you took leave or something to cover a volunteering shift, they got in your business and were very much like, well, that's not how you should be spending your time off, which is obviously not their business, but it can be a difficult dynamic to argue around. So it's always good for then if the volunteering place has a structure where they're like, okay, we understand your circumstances are this, so we will be flexible about when you can come in and volunteer, or whether there's stuff that you could do at home. I find a lot of like volunteering, if you're renaming documents and things like that, you could do that at home. So it might be just that, provide that extra bit of flexibility depending on the volunteer circumstances. I think that's really important.
Yeah, me too, definitely. Thank you. Anybody else? Gary?
Yeah, it's just what Miss Ellie B just put in the chat, actually, which are really important, is that to make sure that the volunteers are not isolated and they mix with other people and they get to find out from other people. Chatting over lunch and networking is incredibly important, and it makes people feel worthwhile, that they're doing a good job as well, make them recognised for that. And also one other tip is see if the volunteer can somehow get access to any sort of staff discount that's going along, because sometimes they're allowed to do that.
Yeah, I've seen that in quite a few places. At least, 10% from the shop, the same as staff usually, it seems a really fair thing to offer. Pauline or Anna, would you like to add anything at all? And if not, then that's okay. Anna.
I was just going to add, I think for a few volunteers in previous jobs I've had, we actually, with expenses, for example, I think sometimes there's the expectation that, for example, for travel expenses, that you just pay for it and then you get a reimbursement later. And I think that's also an excluding practice, because some people don't even, they don't have money for that. So actually, for some volunteers who needed it, we actually offered to pay for the expenses sort of straight away, because the whole process can take up to a month, depending on the organization, depending on how it's done. Sometimes you have to go online to do it, to claim, or you have to fill in a form. So there's a lot of steps there that will, put some people off who, if they don't have a job, or if they're looking for a job, they're already, in a vulnerable situation in a way. So you don't want to make that worse with certain volunteering practices, and also I think we were trying to sort of move on to things like micro volunteering and just different practices that don't set an hour, like a certain time of the week, and not have that expectation that it is weekly or it's fortnightly. Some volunteers would just sort of float around, and they would come in, and depending on the project or the purpose of it, they would sort of come in when they could see that maybe we needed a few more people for an event or something like that as well.
Thank you very much. Pauline.
Building up on what Anna just said, about not wanting to make the volunteers be more vulnerable than they are given their position, like some of them might be unemployed and not be working. So I've had this experience that one day I was told to come in very early in the morning, so I had to catch a peak train. I arrived at the museum, a museum that I won't name, only to be told that actually the project had been cancelled. So I had come all the way, I had commuted, it took me an hour, and I had paid for a very expensive train ticket, and it took about 3 months, and I had to chase them for ages to get my money back. And that is coupled with, it made me feel bad personally, because it made me feel like they didn't care about me at all. And that's also linked to something else, that sometimes it would be good for staff at the museums who volunteer to recognize that volunteers don't have no skills, basically. Like sometimes I was talked to in some places, like basically like I didn't really know how to do anything, or like I was there some volunteering, but I can't do this or I can't do that. And I think it's really important for people to recognize that we're here, we have a background, some of us are struggling, we're unemployed or whatnot. So it's very important to keep what we're talking about, the power relationship, to make sure you're actually talking like someone who does have skills and a background and should be valued.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've seen that lots of times myself. And also I think that relates to what Ellie was saying and what Garry said about involving volunteers in team events and team building. Volunteers are part of the team. They're delivering on the projects. They're helping the museum run. Sometimes they're the reason the museums can open the doors at all. So valuing them as human beings with skills and experience is the absolute minimum that you can do, frankly. I also would just add to all of those excellent things that I think that support in referencing job applications, CV building, and for example, if there's internal opportunities, then taking time to help them with the process if necessary, not necessarily prioritizing them, but just explaining that there's talking through what the job is and asking any questions that they might have, answering any questions they might have. I've also seen in places where 0 hours contracts exist, so for summer front of house kind of roles, where I've been before, volunteers have always been given first choice to apply to those before they're released to the public. So obviously the 0 hours contracts are horrible in a million ways, but it's just a kind of recognition that these volunteers are here giving their time and that maybe they deserve a chance to be paid. So, okay, more cheerfully, I wondered if you had example or several examples of excellent volunteer placement practice that you'd like to share, either something that you've experienced or something that you've set up or that you've seen. Eleanor.
Yeah, I can give an example. When I first started out, I volunteered at Perth Museum and Art Gallery, which is a really small museum in Scotland. And then since then, I've worked in very big museums, both volunteering and not. And I can safely say that you feel much more respected and almost safe in a small museum with a volunteering than you do in big museums. I feel often with big museums, you can get very overlooked. Or I've found there to be a divide between paid workers and volunteers, and you very much can feel excluded and an outsider. And it's fine if there's other volunteers that you can sort of speak to, but I definitely would say there's definitely a vibe of like it's us and them. But in small museums, I've never found that. In small museums, I've always felt really respected, and I've always felt like they actually value me coming in. Perth Museum in particular was really good. They sort of went through with me what sort of projects they had coming up, which ones I'd like to help with, if there was any other areas I wanted to try out just to see if I liked them. So I did a little bit on like the learning side of things, which I thought was really useful because that's still experience you've gained. So even if you don't go into a learning part of the museum, you can basically flip any part of museum experience and make it relevant to whatever role you're going to. So I'd say that's really, really useful and really good to watch out. If there's a small museum placement, always go for it.
Yeah, totally. Would really, really, really agree with that. Thank you. Garry.
Yeah, I know everybody says it, but just to emphasize that volunteering does help you get a job. My volunteering role in the archives specifically led to me getting my first job as a professional archivist because I didn't have the qualifications. I just had the volunteer experience of cataloguing and working in a local borough archive. So that was brilliant, really. And some of the best experiences I've had is when I've managed volunteers and they've gone on to get good jobs as well in the past. Somebody who is a volunteer I know is now working as an archivist in New York, for instance. So it's really nice to do that, particularly in the archive sector, because to actually get admitted into the course for the qualification, you have to have at least a year's experience, which is usually volunteering. So it's important in my field for that.
Thank you. And should we move on to Pauline now? Because I think you were going to talk at the same time as Eleanor. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was just to share something I had done and that could be interesting for young people, if there are any here. When I was at Kettle Yard, I was part of a group called Circuit, and it was only for young people aged 18 to 25. And the goal was to create projects to complement what was going on at the museum. And it was every Wednesday. We would meet every Wednesday for 2 hours and work on these projects. And they had a visible impact on the museum. We created resources, we organized events, and this was probably one of the most valuable things I've done in terms of getting experience, because we even curated an exhibition, and for young people to get to curate an exhibition like that with no experience, that was great. So I guess similar things might exist somewhere else, so it's worth looking things like that up.
Thank you. That sounds really good. And Lucy beat me with the link. I was just looking that up. She got there first. Anna.
I was just going to add, I think it's probably a similar experience to what Pauline had, and it's not for young people only, but I was very lucky to be involved in the Citizen Curators Programme, which is run by the Cornwall Museums Partnership. And the leader is Tamina Goshkar, who's amazing as well. And if you live in Cornwall and you're interested in knowing more about curatorial collections practice, go for it. But it was quite interesting because it was like a 9 months long program, but in terms of CV building, it was just amazing, just huge trade-off with the skills. So it was experiential learning. So we had monthly sessions with Tamina discussing lots of different skills, things like communication, research, etc. And we were then placed in the museums as well alongside it. So it was a really amazing experience, and everything, the admin side, the expenses, everything just worked really well. And we had a chance to also curate and actually affect how collections were displayed and discussed even. So that was a really amazing experience. But again, it's more of a project almost. So it's not perhaps like the everyday experience you might get as a volunteer, but if you can find experiences like that in where you are, yeah, they're just really amazing, really worth doing.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, so I've got 2 different examples of really effective volunteering roles that I've had. So the first was at York Explore Museums and Libraries and Archives. So firstly, I'd say that volunteering experience in the heritage sector in general is useful, not just in museums. There's a lot of transferable skills between them. But there I was part of a group which was conserving the archives there and cleaning them up and getting them ready to be packaged. But the thing about that was that it was a really social group, and that's something about volunteering that can be really good as well. If you have a group of volunteers that you're going in, week out, you're starting to chat with them and everything, and you can often meet a load of people that you wouldn't normally do so. So I was the only young person there. Everyone else was 40s, 50s and above. But it was just really nice to talk to people and people who shared different passions. And the second example is completely different and not, unfortunately, not applicable to all. But my placement, my volunteer placement during my master's was really good. So I was going in 2 days a week for maybe over a period of 8 months, but it meant that I got a chance to do lots of different things at the Royal Armouries, and just, yeah, such a breadth, and it tied in with the course as well. So if anyone is doing a master's, and I know that's not available to everyone, I would thoroughly recommend looking for one that has a placement in it, because you can gain a lot out of them.
Thank you very much. Yes, I also got to do a placement as part of mine. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up what Natalie said here, that praising and thanking volunteers is really important. I've always made it explicit to volunteers that they're welcome to contact me for references, but many student volunteers I've worked with have been too shy to ask. I've said not to worry if a lot of time has passed, as more places seem to be asking for a greater range of references. Yeah, that seems to be a kind of more than 2 seems to crop up a little bit these days, although I've not seen that personally, I've just heard of it. But I definitely agree that praising and thanking volunteers is really key. I've been at a place where the manager didn't even like volunteers coming to the Christmas party, which is ridiculous. I know, yes. Anyway, we disagreed and they came. So of course they did, and we had a kind of second party as well that time. I was thinking, picking up a little bit about something that came up earlier on about this year for volunteering. So if you are somebody looking for practical work experience right now and you're stuck in lockdowns of different levels all over the country, what kind of things have any of you seen that people could do? Do you have any recommendations? Do you have any thoughts on even just what the impact might be at all of COVID? Eleanor?
Yeah, I've seen a few things where I think the National Archives definitely did it, where they posted on their website a series of documents that they needed transcribed, and anyone could go on and look at the document and transcribe it, and then obviously it would be double checked to make sure everything, but that was something they were offering, and that wasn't even if you were a volunteer, that was just anyone who had an interest in it, and I thought that was really useful. I think within that they did their own specific one for volunteers as well to make sure that they had something to do. But I have also heard that a few places have been giving things that they can take home to do, because for a lot of places they haven't been able to reopen, or if they've reopened, they've then reclosed. You know, it also depends on what your volunteer role is or what specific area you want to go into. So like if you were a front of house volunteer, you may be more impacted than a back of house volunteer, because with back of house, there might be something you can do at home, or you might be allowed into the building because you're not open to the public. But front of house, because if your museum isn't open, there's nothing for you to do, and it's a bit hard to give you front of house work to do at home. So I found that was really interesting. I also know of a few places that were giving, for example, if you're like a tour guide, they were sending home ideas of how you could make a new tour or pick a new object to do a new tour on for when we did reopen. So I know that there's a few things you can do like that, but it's really difficult to even try and get a volunteering position this year because everything has been so affected. So yeah.
Yeah, hasn't it? Yeah, then that's actually quite interesting, because one of the questions we had through Eventbrite was around how can you get any volunteering opportunity that isn't front of house. I think there's a much greater need for front of house volunteers. There's an awful lot of gallery enablers, gallery attendants, that kind of thing. And I think there was a frustration clearly from that person, but I've seen it in others that it's very hard to get back of house experience or something more detailed. And as somebody, I have often worked in collections management, and when you're making placements for collections management, you're usually restricted to a smaller number because you can't supervise so many, or you only have one table, or there's just not enough space in the room. So yeah, I just think it's interesting that that's kind of maybe flipped at the moment. Anna?
Yeah, I think I did have a question on Twitter, similar question. I think maybe that person is on as an attendee here today, but front of house experience. But I have seen, I can't remember where, but I have seen sort of like event support. So, you know, a lot of organizations are doing things over Zoom like we are now. And they were sort of going to train volunteers on how to be moderators and things like that, and just general event support, or just moderating the chat, for example. So I know it's not front of house, but at least you're still dealing with, you know, engaging with the public, dealing with the public, and events experience is always welcome. And I think, yeah, archives, I have to agree with Eleanor, and I think some of what's being posted as well, archives, even like Cres and Kerner, which is the Cornish archives, they even have a like give me a go sort of page, and you can have a go at transcribing and seeing if it's for you, and then you can get in touch and do that. So definitely I think archives, wherever you are, you know, could be something. And I think there has been some with collections as well, a lot of people sort of trying to put collections online. I want to say sort of, I think it's a museum down in Reading or something like that, like in Countryside Life, something like that, and they were putting opportunities on Twitter and that with collections. So I think there are opportunities, but again, I think my worry is just that, you know, it's very digital, and I just worry about who are we excluding with sort of digital only opportunities as well. And I think in terms of, you know, socially, just the sense of isolation that we all get from this year as well. And I think that's something that we definitely need to tackle, you know, as a volunteer or volunteer manager.
Yeah, that's really true, that it's not just whether there's opportunities, but it's part of that volunteering, like Stuart was saying, and I've definitely had that experience, I'm sure others have, is that social kind of supportive, exchanging ideas and thoughts and seeing people and working on a task together, where you can end up doing that completely by yourself. and how managers maybe need to think about that really hard at the moment. Stuart.
Yeah, so going back to your point, Katrina, about how to get back of house experience, because that was primarily what I was looking for. I'd say again, cast your net wider. Don't just look in museums, look in archives, libraries, any other form of heritage institution, because there are a lot of similar object-based volunteering placements in these places, even if they're not perhaps specifically museum-based. I think there's still a lot to be said for them. And I think they do, museums will take it into account when you're applying for their own positions.
Yeah, definitely. And also considering sector network groups. So we've had various sector support showcases, but for example, I did some stints on the Midlands Federation of Museum and Art Galleries Committee. I've been on the Society for Museum Archaeology Committee, and you get a really broad view of all kinds of sector issues by doing that, but it's also a voluntary experience. So it's a good thing to do. I've just seen a question from Tiffany that I think is quite good. I'm an English literature undergraduate, but I've been interested in volunteering and perhaps trying to get into museums. I volunteered in Godalming Museum briefly before having to go to university. Was wondering if museums are looking for any particular skills in volunteering or a particular degree. So we've covered a lot of discussion around qualifications in other sessions, Tiffany. So if you keep an eye out on our, when we share the sessions from this summit, that will be worth having a look at. But I was wondering if anybody would like to pick up the question about particular volunteering skills. It kind of depends what you're interested in as well, Tiffany, but yeah, would anyone like to? Garry?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that actually, from my point of view, working in an archives is slightly different to being a curator or doing front of house. So I would certainly have a look at what you want to work in a museum rather than just in a museum. And also maybe one of the things I'd suggest is if you can go and speak to somebody in a museum or go and shadow someone. I mean, I'm always quite happy to take emails and comments and stuff like that. And I'm sure most other people in museums are. Sometimes they're really busy, but you know, if you're very specific in your wishes, then they're always got time for you, I think.
I think shadowing is a great suggestion. I think more people should offer that. I also think, as you said that, I was thinking about when I've run volunteering projects, I've tried to explain the context and why the project's happening. So usually that involves discussion around things like accreditation, but I think that's really important so that volunteers know why you're doing anything. And I was also thinking while Stuart was speaking that not taking no for an answer is another really good thing. So I've tried to get volunteering experience at one quite famous museum and contacted the proper route, the volunteer coordinator. They said, terribly sorry, lots of applications, no space. I contacted the curator and explained my background and why I wanted to do the thing and what I could help with. And she leapt up the opportunity and I got to volunteer there. So yeah, use networks if you have them. If you have networks that you can help other people with, use those on people's behalf, and don't take no for an answer if you want something very much. Would anyone else like to talk about the COVID impact or the other things you could do this year to volunteer? Pauline?
If you're looking at volunteering and you're struggling to find volunteering in the sector, you could also think about what transferable skills you could get from volunteering outside of the sector. And I know that in Manchester at uni, they specifically encourage students to volunteer. There's a massive volunteering platform. And I think that's really useful because you'll still be doing something if you want to volunteer. You'll still meet people, you'll still gain some skills. So don't focus only on the sector if you're really that keen, and think about these skills, because then you can use them as well, you know, in whatever career path you end up doing.
Yes, absolutely. And always bear that in mind for anyone writing a job application. It doesn't matter where you got the experience if it's relevant to the item on the person spec. Natalie has asked, do the panel have any insights about making volunteering more accessible? I worked with a local college for young people living with disabilities and ran a short volunteer placement for one of their students. It really highlighted to me how inaccessible so many aspects of our volunteer roles were at the time. Garry?
Yeah, well, at the RAF Museum, quite a lot of our volunteers are quite elderly, some with some mobility issues, and we certainly based the projects that they're doing around them. I mean, unfortunately, because of COVID, they've not been back since March. But that again goes back to communicating with somebody that you want to be with, as saying what you can actually do as well as unfortunately what you can't do, and they should be able to make a project to work with you. Actually, if you've obviously will have the passion for the job, and that's the important thing.
Absolutely, thank you. Anna.
I think this one might be a bit out there, but as a student, I remember the Students' Union, for example, they run a lot of like one-off volunteering projects and just sort of like micro volunteering, and they organize the whole thing with the institution. So they literally organize for travel for the students, and it was all done under a budget from the Students' Union, for example. And they organize everything, the packed lunches, everything, and people would go. And for some museums, think about Devon, Cornwall, different counties, they can be quite rural, and and because of that, accessibility is key. So and it was brilliant because it was a whole day packed, and there was no you could just do the one day and one off and not really feel like you had to do other days. So I think maybe that's something that maybe the wider sector we could look into, building those partnerships with perhaps people that we don't look for in that way. And also the net was quite wide, because you would get students from not just the sort of usual suspects, if I may say so, sort of humanities and that, but you'd get students from all sorts of different areas, and that's really important as well.
Thank you. Eleanor, did you want to?
Yeah, the V&A ran a project until this year, every summer, where because they're setting up a new museum in the east, which is an area that has some areas of neglect, or it's not an area necessarily known for museums. So it's a community project. So what we did with that is we had a pop-up version of the museum that's coming. And we worked with the local councils in those areas to get people from schools, people from the community directly to come along and experience the museum in different ways. So within that, we sort of did collaboration projects or just like general come and see what it's about, to try and like rev up some interest from communities that might not necessarily know much about museums, and particularly for the V&A, which is a big brand museum, but it's known to be in South Kensington, so it's a more wealthy area. So I'd have to say that was a good idea, although we don't tend to run community projects in South Kensington, which I think we should do, because there are areas there in which we could build up community. But I think community is a way to go forward, to try and include a lot of people that normally volunteering or events wouldn't hit.
Yeah, and I also think maybe partnering with local organisations that can help you. So at Guildford Heritage Service, we had a long-term partnership with a charity that supported young people with learning disabilities to get work experience and to build up to job applications and various other things. And so we used to work with them and describe some of the things that could be done in the museum, and then their team would help advise which young people might be interested in that kind of thing. And then we just worked on making it possible all the time, which is really, really positive. We got so much out of it. Garry?
Yeah, I was just wanting to add to that we can forget sometimes that a lot of people just assume museums and galleries are not for them, and they're the people we want to get into volunteering. They're the people we want in museums. That's really in many ways what Fair Jobs is all about, really.
Here. Somehow we have only 3 minutes left, which is astonishing. 2 minutes. My last question. So we're going to do this in 2 minutes. So the question is, should volunteering be a career development route at all? Can it ever be made equitable? 2 minutes go. Who wants to start? Might be too much. Eleanor, go for it.
I mean, I think you can't say categorically either way. I do wish that it wasn't the way it is at the moment, and I do wish that like you could get some form of better development, or I think it needs to be improved upon vastly, because it's not feasible for many people due to the fact that you're not paid, but that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't get anything out of it. So it has been the key to many, many people's jobs in the sector. So it is that sort of, it should stick around if we can do it better. And doing it better is the thing we need to work on, I think.
Agreed. Stuart?
So in an ideal world, I'd say no, we shouldn't have volunteering as an entryway into the sector, unless if you want to volunteer, you should do it because you want to, not because you have to do it to get a job. But it will be necessary ultimately. But I feel as though museums should make a greater effort to have more paid placements to more paid internships to get into the sector.
Thank you. Anybody else for the last set? Anna.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what's been said. And I think, yeah, definitely paid apprenticeships, traineeships, internships, placements, you name it. But I think yesterday in the fundraising session, one of the panelists mentioned briefly that maybe for every fundraising bid you do, you should include a paid intern for that project. And I found that was really refreshing and maybe a way forward.
Agreed. We're at time, unfortunately, so we have to come to a close. I just wanted to say to anybody who's here who is a volunteer now or wants to get into the sector, perhaps we could all make a commitment today to once you've made it in the sector, to try and improve things for the next lot of volunteers. So always try to do better, and then hopefully they'll want to do better too. Thank you so much for everybody for being in our panel today. You've all been absolutely brilliant. This time has absolutely flown past, and I think, like with every session, we could probably have had at least an entire day on this subject. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, and I hope everybody has a lovely Saturday. I'll let you enjoy the comments, and then eventually Lucy will end the session and it will be weirdly abrupt. So sorry about that, that's Zoom. Thank you, everyone.
I'll give you all a little bit of warning now. I'm going to close the session now.